Hello everyone, welcome to Bake with Chef by APCA Malaysia. My name is Angelo Van Toorn, Executive Baker, and today I'll be talking to you a little bit about bread theory. Now, when we're making bread, the basic theory that you'll learn in this course is going to apply to all the breads that we're using, whether in our basic, intermediate, and advanced course as well as vinoiserie. We have the same type of ingredients. Flour, water, salt, and yeast are our base ingredients for bread. So if we just follow the certain things that you'll watch in this video, you'll be able to make successful bread. One thing I would like to let you know is that bread baking has a very steep learning curve. Everything is going to change from environment to environment. Because you're dealing with yeast, which is a living ingredient, it's going to be very temperamental according to the temperatures, the hydration, and humidity where you're working. So the best thing for you to do is just to practice. Bake more bread and then you'll understand. Also, when I go to different places, I find different flours, different temperatures, and through experience, I learn how to deal with these. So when you're baking bread at home, you may have to adjust your times according to the fermentation or according to the flour that you're using. But if you follow the principles that I'll teach you in this theory class, it'll make it a lot easier for you to understand where you can go and where you can fix according to what you have. So here we have some of the common ingredients that we'll use in bread making. And these are some of the ingredients we'll also be using inside of our bread courses. So I just want you to understand the different ingredients that we have and a little bit about each one. So we're going to start with the most important ingredient we have, which is flour. So in all of our breads, we're using bread flour. Now, what differentiates bread flour from all-purpose flour or cake flour is going to be the protein content. So when I say protein, I'm talking about the gluten and gliadin, which are the proteins inside the flour that form gluten. Gluten is that network that we're looking for that's going to help trap carbon dioxide, hold the bread shape, and allow the bread to rise. So the amount of protein that we're ideally looking for in our flour is between 11.5 to 12% for bread making. This is going to constitute bread flour. There's also high protein flour, which can be between 13 even up to 15% protein. We have all-purpose flour, which can be around 9 to 10% protein, and cake and pastry flour, which are lower than that. So for all of our breads, you want to try to find a flour that is a protein content of at least 11%. Now, another thing that we have inside is going to be salt. Salt's another very important ingredient inside of our bread. Salt's going to serve a few purposes. One, salt is going to enhance the flavor of the bread. A bread without salt will not have much of a taste. It's going to be very bland. The other purpose of salt is it's going to control the fermentation. So salt will slow down the yeast activity. So if we have too much salt in your dough, you're going to find your dough is going to be very sticky and proofing very slow. If you don't have enough salt inside your dough, you may find that your bread is proofing really, really fast. For salt, I'm just using normal kosher salt or iodized salt, but you can use sea salt as well. Another one we have is going to be oil. Oil and butter, we have both of these. They're both fats that we put inside the bread. They're going to add moisture to the dough. They're also going to make our breads a bit softer and also more extensible, meaning the bread will be softer because we have fat inside, but this fat is also going to make the dough more extensible in case like a croissant or like a pizza. We maybe put oil inside the pizza that's also going to allow the dough to stretch more easy. Now, one important thing when we're looking at the fat content of our recipe is the amount of fat we have inside. If our fat is 10% or more of the flour weight, you'll see we're going to have to add the fat at the end of the mixing. This is because the fat is going to coat the proteins, not allow them to absorb water, and the protein bonds forming the gluten won't be so strong. So less than 10%, we can put the fats in the beginning. More than 10%, what we're going to have to do is form that gluten first, and only then we'll slowly add the fat after the dough has formed. Next, we have yeast. Now, this is one of the most important things inside of our bread. We use it in all of our breads. Even when we're using sourdough breads, it's actually a wild form of yeast. So when we're using commercial yeast, it's actually just a single strain of bacteria, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which has been put either into a powder form or a cake form. Now, what we're using in most of our breads is instant yeast. Now, we also have fresh yeast as well. Fresh yeast, you'll find, comes in a cake form, almost looks like a butter block, and has the texture of somewhat like a dry cream cheese. So when we're using the yeast or fresh yeast, we should know how much we should use. In our recipes, if your recipe calls for instant yeast and you want to use fresh, you're going to have to multiply the amount of instant yeast divided by times 3. You're going to have to multiply the amount of instant yeast times 3 to get the amount of fresh yeast that you need. If you have fresh yeast in a recipe and you want to use instant, you'll do the same thing but backwards. You'll divide the amount of fresh yeast by 3, and that'll tell you how much instant yeast to do. The biggest thing about fresh and instant yeast is fresh yeast has a shelf life of about 2 weeks. Because in general, fresh yeast, it has a lot more moisture content, so the fresh yeast is actually live and active. Our instant yeast is in more of a dormant state, so the shelf life for instant yeast in a cool room temperature is about 2 months, and inside the refrigerator, airtight, we can keep it for much longer. Next, we have water. Water is usually the second largest portion of ingredient inside of our recipe. The water is going to serve the purpose of hydrating the flour, allowing the proteins that we talked about, gluten and gliadin, they will absorb and swell up and begin to form gluten. Without water, we won't have anything to hydrate the flour, and we won't be able to make bread. Now, any kind of water that you want to use is going to be fine. As long as it's drinkable water, we can use it for making bread. With some notes, water that has a high mineral content will generally make the bread ferment faster and also going to form a more stronger dough. So if you have a high mineral content water and you find your bread is coming out more dense and chewy, you may want to use some type of filtered or bottled water. Another ingredient that we can add to our bread will be sugar. Now, sugar is going to add a bit sweetness, and also because yeast converts sugar into carbon dioxide and alcohol, the more sugar we put in the bread, generally the faster it's going to ferment as well. So when we're adding sugar, generally it's going to be about 2 to 5% of the flour weight. But in products like viennoiserie, it could possibly be more. So when you're looking at the sugar, it's going to make our bread a bit more softer, a bit more sweeter, and it's also going to increase the fermentation slightly. Now also, we have dried fruits and nuts. Now when we're looking at dried fruits, nuts, and seeds, they're all going to have the same kind of property. They're going to add texture and different flavors to our bread. One thing that we should look for when we're adding fruits and nuts, if I'm adding nuts or seeds, it'd be a good idea to toast them first. It'll add a little bit more flavor to our bread. Now also when we're adding hard ingredients such as dried fruits, seeds, or nuts, they'll always go in at the end of mixing. If we put them in the beginning, it's going to be hard for the gluten to form inside and make bonds because these will disrupt and get in between. Now another thing is when we have dried fruits or nuts, one thing you can do is you can soak them overnight in water or some other type of liquid. It can be a juice or a flavored alcohol or anything that you like. So what this is going to do is it's going to allow the nuts and seeds and dried fruits to absorb moisture. So when we bake the bread, instead of the nuts and seeds taking moisture away from the bread, they'll actually be adding moisture. So if you want your bread to be a little bit more moist for a longer period of time, and you're going to have these ingredients inside, I suggest for you to soak them overnight. Very easy. You just cover them in water and you let them sit. The next day, if there's any excess water, just drain it off. Make your dough like normal, and then we just add in the fruits and seeds gently on first speed. Now, another few ingredients that we may possibly add in bread will be milk or eggs. Now, milk and eggs are both going to add fat content and moisture to the bread. So when we add milk and eggs to the dough, they're going to add a little bit of fat, making the bread a bit softer, and also they're going to make the bread a little bit more lighter in texture. Now, if you don't want to use eggs inside your bread, we can actually replace the eggs with a bit of water, or also we can use milk as well. Just note, if you're not going to use eggs inside the bread recipe, the color may be a little bit lighter because we don't have the same kind of color coming from the egg yolks inside, but we'll still come out with a nice bread. This will also pertain to egg wash as well. If you don't want to use egg wash on your bread, we can either bake it without, but the color will become a little bit lighter for things like soft rolls or soda bread. Also, you can use a little bit of milk and sugar and then brush the bread as well. The color will also come out a little bit more lighter than eggs, but we can do if we don't want to put eggs in our product. So these are all the common ingredients that we use inside the bread baking. So I hope you can understand. And one thing to remember is ingredients will always change from place to place, brand to brand, and also store to store. So especially with flour, the best thing for you to do is be able to test. especially flour, when I'm trying to make a new flour and I'm not sure, I'll make a simple baguette dough. I'll follow the same thing I always use with my old flour, and then I'll test it. The best way to learn how to make better bread is just to practice. Use different flours, make more, take notes, and then you'll be able to understand the ingredients a lot better. So, for some of the tools that we'll be using in this course and all the bread classes that we'll be doing is a few basic things. So now I'm going to discuss with you some of the basic tools that we use in bread making. We'll be using most of these during this course on teaching you how to make bread, and all of these will be used generally in all bread making environments. So you don't need to have all of these tools, but having some of these will help you out, and I'll explain each of them one by one. So here I have bench scrapers. So I have a plastic and a metal version. Up to you what you want to use, but it should feel comfortable to your hand. The other thing for the bench scraper is it should have a flat end, because we're going to be using this to cut and divide on the table or the board our dough. Next, I have something similar, is a bowl scraper. So this is the same type of material, but it's more flexible and has a rounded edge. We'll use this for taking dough out of the bowl and scraping round surfaces. We have a sifter, which we use for dusting flour on the bread or onto the couche or wherever we're proofing the bread. So we don't have a large amount of flour and we get a nice even coating. So this is actually a tea strainer, but we can use any kind of sifter, but the finer the better. We have lams. Lams are basically blades that we use for scoring and cutting the bread. They come in many different fashions. You can see here I have a large wooden handle, and here I have a soft plastic handle. Basically, it should be comfortable for you to use. But when you're buying the lam, they do have a few features to them. These ones have a removable blade. This is the same type of safety razor that you can buy for like an old-fashioned safety razor for shaving. But what these do is you can take and you can bend, and then you can put onto this stick, which is the holder for the lam. Now what you'll notice with these ones is we're getting a slight curve. This will help us, especially on breads like baguette, getting a nice angle into the dough, which will give us more of a nice ear on the bread as well. Now, sometimes they sell something with a curve like this, but you cannot remove the blade, it's disposable. These are fine as well. You cannot take this blade off, they usually come in plastic, and then when you're done, they're not sharp anymore, you throw out and buy a new one. They also have lams that come plastic, disposable, but straight. It's just a straight blade on a stick, and you're gonna have to be more careful with the angle when you're holding it, just to make sure that you get a good angle on the bread. Next, we have our dough hook. This is what we'll be using for mixing the breads. Now, our machines come with a lot of attachment, whisks, paddles, and hooks. Hooks are the one that you're going to use for mixing all of your doughs. They spin at the right speed and they have a right curvature to develop the dough without overheating or without tearing the gluten structure. We also have a paddle attachment. Sometimes we'll use the paddle attachment for adding butter into the dough, like a brioche at the very, very end. Here I have a room thermometer. Now this is not necessary, but it helps me later when I adjust the water temperature for my bread, and when I'm proofing, to always see the temperature and even the humidity for my room. It's just nice to help control and see what's going on. Now here I have a timer. Now this is a multi-timer, but it's very important to have timers for your bread because you need to watch the bread and the timing very closely. The bread is proofing and rising. If you do too early, then you don't have enough CO2 or development in the dough. If you leave it sitting for too long, the dough will overproof, not taste nice, it won't look nice, and even in the worst cases, collapse. Here we have a couche. This is hemp or sometimes even cotton cloth that we use for proofing the bread. What's nice about these is, especially for something like baguettes, we can place our baguette on top, we can fold them and place multiple baguettes, which will hold the shape of the dough, and as well as I have more room for proofing as opposed to putting directly on the tray. If you don't have a couche like this one, sometimes depending upon the dough, we can put it directly on the tray. Or you can even use a clean kind of fiber, like even a kitchen apron that's not very porous, and you can proof on this with a little bit of flour as well. You just don't want to proof on something that's very porous because the dough will stick inside. Here we have a flipping board for the baguette. This is nothing special. It's a wooden board that we use for transferring the dough. So if you don't have this one, you can go to any kind of hardware shop or supply shop, by just a thin wooden board, which we can use for transferring the baguettes. You can even cut one out of a thick piece of cardstock or cardboard if you like as well. It's just going to help us from moving from the couche onto here and then onto our tray for long breads like baguettes. So we also have a rolling pin. I like to use a French style wooden rolling pin, meaning it doesn't have the rollers on the side, but anything that's comfortable for you is fine to use. It also helps to have multiple sizes of rolling pins, so you can use for big and small. Now next here I have some bannetons. These are basically wicker baskets in which I can proof the dough. Now some of them will come with like a couche or a cloth inside, and some will come with nothing. This one, if I dust with flour, because I have this spiral pattern, if I dust it nicely, when I overturn, I'll get a pattern on the dough as well. But if you don't have these are okay. We can put in some kind of bowl or basket with a cloth inside and dust it with flour. And then also we have bins for proofing. I like to use clear plastic bins so I can see the dough without having to open. So this will be used for when we have the dough and we're doing the proofing. We have something that we can cover and proof the dough inside. And then finally, we also have a stand mixer. Now in this course, we'll be using a stand mixer for all of our doughs because it's just the most practical way to use. But any of the breads that we're making, you can also do by hand. I show you in this course and also during the lessons how to tell what the dough looks like and when it's ready. So if you're mixing the dough by hand, we just have to check for the gluten development and make sure we can get a window or get the proper texture on the dough, and then you'll get the same kind of result. And finally, we have a soft bristle brush. We use this for things like egg washes or brushing some oil on the dough for certain shapes as well. So anything that's food grade and preferably a softer one. I don't like to use the silicone brushes, especially for egg washing, because they don't give a nice smooth egg wash. So no matter what type of bread we make, we have the same steps that we're going to follow for all types of yeasted products. So by understanding the terminology and what's happening during each of these steps, it'll help you know what to look for when you're deciding to continue on with your bread making process. So the first step we have is scaling and preparing our ingredients. Obviously, we want to use high quality ingredients and then we scale them correctly. This will lead for success for the rest of the recipe. After we scale our ingredients, then our second step will be mixing. During the mixing process, we're hydrating the flour, hydrating the yeast, and we're developing gluten inside the dough. At this stage, we're going to develop most of the dough's strength. Later on, we can give a stage of folding and develop some more strength, but 90% of the work will be done inside the machine or by hand during the initial mixing phase. By achieving a good gluten development, our CO2 from the yeast will be able to be trapped inside the dough and allow the bread to rise. After the mixing, then we'll go for the bulk fermentation. So after we've taken the dough out of the machine and we've checked for the gluten formation, then we'll put it into a container and we'll begin the rising of the dough. During this stage, what's going to happen is the yeast is going to start breaking down starches and eating sugars, and then it's going to develop alcohol and carbon dioxide. The alcohol is a byproduct which will burn off during the baking, but also give some flavor to the bread. And then the carbon dioxide being released during the bulk fermentation is going to be the air that's trapped in our dough. It's what gets trapped by the gluten, allows the bread to rise, and make sure that we have a nice, light, and airy product. So during this bulk fermentation, the yeast, like I said, will be breaking down the sugars, so we have to be very careful that we don't over-ferment the bulk or over-ferment the dough in general. Otherwise, all the sugar will be eaten by the time the bread goes in the oven, and we won't come out with a nice loaf. So as we've seen, we'll show how to show the dough by pressing during this stage so you can see when the bread is ready. The next step we call is folding. Usually sometimes during the bulk fermentation, we'll give a folding to the dough. By folding the dough in on itself, it's going to redistribute the carbon dioxide inside the bread, as well as even out the dough temperature, and at the same time, it's going to develop more dough strength. It'll be like stretching and folding a rubber band. When you stretch the dough, it's going to pull the gluten strands, and then when we fold it over, it's going to align them more evenly. So on a dough that maybe we mix less in the machine, or a dough that's quite wet, this folding stage will help us develop more strength inside the dough so we get a better volume in our final loaf. The next step after folding will be our dividing. This stage is very simple. After the bulk fermentation is complete, we divide the dough into whatever portion grams that we'd like to make our bread. After we divide the dough, our next step we call pre-shaping. So for especially loaves that have more of an elaborate shape or are gonna have to be stretched long like a baguette, we pre-shape the dough first. Because when we cut it from the round or rectangle piece that we had before inside the bin, it's not gonna look exactly like the shape that we want. So by dividing the dough and then shaping roughly into whatever pre-shape we want, it's gonna help us get the dough closer to the final shape without having to overwork the dough. So for example, a baguette, we need a long baton of dough. So when we divide the dough, we pre-shape into a small log. This is gonna get the shape closer to a baguette, so we'll rest the dough and then we can get a nicer baguette later on. Coming to that, we have the bench rest, which after we pre-shape the dough, we allow the dough to rest for about 15 to 20 minutes, depending upon our temperature, and then it's gonna allow the dough to relax. After this relaxes, it'll be easier for us to get to the final shape. After the bench rest, we go to our final shaping. Simply, we shape the dough to get the desired look that we want. When we're doing the final shaping of the dough, one thing we're looking for is to create tension inside the dough, as well as get a nice and clean and even shape. So for a baguette, we fold it over and then fold it a second time. It's gonna give us more of a nice tight shape, but we don't wanna be very rough. We developed a lot of CO2 during the dough when it's in the bulk fermentation. So if we go ahead and knock all of it out now, we may not be able to achieve the same level of rise or the same level of open crumb and we get to after our final shaping before baking. So if we degas the dough too much, we won't be able to get the same kind of volume after the final proofing before baking. So after the final shaping is done, then we go to the final fermentation. This is the last time we're gonna let the dough rise before going in the oven. So during the shaping part, we lose a little bit of the volume. We knock out some CO2. So the bread's gonna become slightly denser. So after the final shape, we're gonna proof it again to develop more carbon dioxide in the dough and as well as release some of the sugars being broken down from the starch. So we get a nice light loaf with a good caramelization. After we've done the final fermentation, then we have the option of scoring the bread. Scoring the bread has multiple purposes. One, it's gonna make the bread look nice, give a design or like a signature for your bread. Next, by scoring, it allows the bread to rise in a predetermined area of the loaf. Meaning if I had a baguette and I didn't score it, as the bread rises and then the crust begins to form, it's gonna want to release pressure somewhere. So perhaps my baguette might crack here and here, or down here, or even from the seam on the bottom. When we score the bread, we choose exactly where this pressure is gonna release. So the dough will rise in a more even pattern during the oven spring, and as well as it's gonna crack where we want, giving the bread more of a nicer look. So the scoring, it'll give us look as well as a good volume and shape to our bread. Now after we scored the bread, we're then gonna put it into the oven. Now for all of these artisan breads, we're looking to bake at a high temperature because we want a really strong oven spring. Oven spring is when I put it in the oven and the high temperature heats up the dough and we start rapidly building carbon dioxide before the yeast dies off. This is what allows the bread to rise and our scoring to open. So for these types of lean doughs, means there's no butter or sugar inside, or maybe oil. We're gonna use a very high temperature because they won't color too easy, around 240 to 250 degrees Celsius. Now when we put it in the oven, something else that we're gonna need is steam. For these breads that don't have any fat inside, we need some steam to keep the crust soft. So what we do is if our steam has steam injection in our oven, we can inject it directly inside the oven. What this steam is gonna do is gonna prevent the crust from forming during the initial stages of baking, keeping the crust soft. So one, the bread rises nicely, and then two, the crust will have a nice thin crust by the end of baking because it didn't start drying out early in the baking step. Now, after we bake the bread, the last step is finally to remove from the oven and cool the bread down. We never want to take the bread and cut it directly out of the oven. The steam is going to release and it's going to dry our bread very fast. So to keep a longer shelf life and a better texture on our bread, when it comes out of the oven, we need to cool it on a wire rack until completely cool to room temperature, and only then our bread is ready to serve. These are all the steps that we'll follow for every single bread that we make in this course, as well as every single bread that you're going to make outside of this course and in the future as well. If you follow and understand each of these steps, you can go ahead and you can check yourself for any error you have made. So maybe you can go back and say my bulk fermentation needs a little bit longer or a little bit shorter, or maybe my pre-shaping needs a bit more rest. So when you're looking at the bread, if you divide it into these type of sections, you can pinpoint more easily where you're having problems with your bread or places that you can improve on as well. So before we begin mixing our breads, one thing that we want to look out for is going to be the temperature of our water. Now, because yeast ferments at a certain temperature, the warmer the temperature in the environment and of the dough, the faster the dough is going to prove. At a colder temperature of dough or environment, the yeast and the fermentation is going to go slower. So we want to try to control the temperature of the dough when it comes out of the machine each time. Now, ideally, we're shooting for a dough temperature of around 25 degrees. So I'm going to show you now how we can always get our 25-degree dough. So what we need to consider are what factors are going to make the temperature of the dough after mixing. One, we have our flour temperature. This is the majority of the ingredient inside our bread. So whatever temperature that this flour is will bring a lot of temperature to the final dough as well. Next, we have the ambient room temperature in which we're mixing. This is going to affect our dough temperature also. Also, we have our friction developed inside the machine. So as we're mixing the dough, we're developing more heat inside because we're getting friction from the machine and the hook and the bowl. So how to determine the friction of your mixing? Generally, we can say that you'll get 3 degrees Celsius for every minute that you do on a high speed or second speed of mixing. So if our recipe calls for us to mix for 5 minutes on second speed, we can assume we're going to get about 15 degrees Celsius for the fermentation, So we can assume that we're going to get 15 degrees Celsius during the mixing for the friction. Now, every machine rotates at a different speed, and also we have different curvatures of hooks and different doughs. So our friction can change. If you're not exactly sure or it's not working out for you, you can find the friction of your machine easily. You mix a dough, you take the temperature after first speed, and then you continue mixing the dough, and then you'll take the temperature after second speed. You'll find the difference in temperatures and divide that by the amount of time that you spent mixing on second speed. This will tell you exactly how many degrees you develop per minute of second speed. So now to find the water temperature. We've determined that our flour temperature is going to affect. We're going to determine our room temperature will affect, and also our friction. Now the final thing that's going to affect the temperature of our dough will be my water temperature, because it's the second largest amount of ingredient that I have. So of all of these things, the easiest for us to kind of adjust and play with will be water temperature. We can take cold and warm water, mix together until we get a certain temperature, which will balance out everything else to get the final dough temperature we need. So in order to find that appropriate water temperature, what we're going to do is we're going to take the number 75, which will be 25 degrees multiplied by 3 because you want 25-degree dough. So 75 minus our friction, minus our flour temperature, minus our room temperature. So let's say that our friction in the machine will be 5 minutes on second speed, so we'll develop about 15 degrees of friction. Let's say our room temperature is 20 degrees, and my flour is also 20 degrees. If I take 75 minus the 15 from friction, minus the 20 degrees from the flour, and the 20 degrees from my room, I'll have 20 left over. This means if I use 20-degree water, my dough should come out 25 degrees Celsius. If you do this every single time, you get faster at doing, and then also you'll find that your doughs will have a consistent schedule. If your dough comes out warm one day, it won't have the same schedule as it does a previous day where the dough was maybe 25 degrees or it was a bit colder. So now I'm going to show you how to determine the dough finished if it's inside the mixer by checking with a gluten window. So we're just going to take a simple baguette dough recipe, and I'm going to show you the stages along the mixing on what you should be looking for. So we'll put in our water first, as always, followed by our yeast, our bread flour, and our salt. So now I'm going to put on the machine. And I'll begin mixing as I would normally would a baguette, so we'll go 4 minutes on first speed, and then we'll check the dough. What's happening during the mixing is, first of all, the flour is absorbing water. The proteins inside are beginning to absorb water and swell. So they're getting fatter, they're beginning to unwind, and they're forming chains. There's actually 2 inside the flour that was going to make our gluten network. One is glutenin, and the other one is gliadin. So as these proteins swell, they're going to form bonds during the mixing and like a rubber band. So this is what's going to create the strength inside of our dough. So this dough has finished the first speed. So now you can see into the bowl, the dough is not very smooth, and if we pull the dough off, it's going to tear very, very easily. The gluten is not yet developed, and normally it will be at this stage after first speed. So now this dough has finished our first speed. When you're looking at the dough like this, you'll see it's not very smooth. It's torn in a lot of places. And if I pull a piece, it comes off very easily. If this dough is fully developed, it would try to resist and it would pull back. If we try to stretch the dough now, you can see the dough tears very easy. This means the gluten bonds have not formed sufficient strength yet. This is normal to look like after the first speed, but by the time we finish the second speed or all of the mixing, then we should have a smoother dough and we should be able to stretch the dough without tearing. So now we'll do the second speed and we'll check after. So now our dough has finished the second speed of mixing. Let's have a look at what the dough should look like when it's finished and mixed well. So one thing you can see is if we take the dough, we can round it a little bit and the dough is much smoother. Now you'll see as compared to before, if I pull this, it's going to want to pull back. I can't just pull it off and tear it so easy. So what we'll check for this gluten window is we're going to take a piece of dough and we're going to stretch it gently back and forth. I should get to the point where it's see-through before the dough tears. Before you saw when I did this, as soon as I started pulling, it tears and makes holes right away. So you can see if I pull the dough now, it's more elastic, it doesn't pull back. So now we can check for the gluten window. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of dough, I'm going to gently stretch it back and forth. I should be able to get to the point where this window is see-through before it tears. You see before on the last one that I did, the second I start pulling, the dough tears right away. So you can see here, we can get a nice see-through window and the dough isn't tearing yet. This is going to show us that we have enough gluten development so the dough can stretch and it'll be able to trap the carbon dioxide. If you can get this window, then you can know that your dough is done and you can begin the bulk fermentation. So from here, we know how to check for the gluten. We've seen it developed. This dough would now be ready to go for the bulk fermentation phase. So now I'm going to show you how we fold our dough. Now some doughs, depending on the fermentation or the hydration, will give more foldings to, and some we don't need to. Basically the purpose of doing this folding is we're going to stretch the dough and it's going to align the gluten. It's going to redevelop the CO2 inside the dough by redistributing it in different places, as well as even the dough temperature. So we'll get more even distributing of the carbon dioxide and also strengthen the dough through this process. So to give a folding, we're going to put a little bit of flour on top of the dough. We're going to take the dough out onto a bin, and then we're going to fold it 4 ways. So you can actually see this dough has a good amount of carbon dioxide build up inside. So we can see the proofing is nice. And then now we're going to do the 4-way fold. So first we're going to take one side of the dough and then fold it into the center and then just press gently. I'm not trying to knock all the carbon dioxide out. I just want to redistribute it. Next, I'm going to take the other side and then fold it to the middle as well and then just let it stick. Now I'll take another side and repeat the process until I put all 4 sides, fold it nicely. So you can see the dough creates a bit more tension. Instead of being flat, now it has a bit more volume. And also we're going to redistribute the air inside. So after the folding, we'll always continue the bulk fermentation a little bit longer. So once your folding is done, you're just going to transfer it into a container. And then now we'll continue the bulk fermentation until we're ready to divide and pre-shape our breads. So one way to tell if your bread is ready to start dividing is after the bulk fermentation, we look at the dough. One, it should get close to doubling in volume, but not always double. We can see when we touch the dough, we're going to look for a certain texture when we're feeling it and seeing how the dough springs back. So what we'll do is we'll put a little bit of flour on and we're just going to press with our finger. To determine if the dough is ready, we're just going to press our finger into the dough and you'll see it's going to make an indentation but then start to spring back slightly. If you press inside and then the dough doesn't spring back or feels like it's going to be too airy and collapse from the pressure of your finger, you've overproofed your bread. If when you press it, it springs back very fast or feels quite heavy and dense, your bread needs a little bit more time for proofing. So once you press, it leaves a slight indentation but starts to bounce back. You know your bread will be ready for the next stage of either dividing or baking. For any of the breads that we're making, they're going to follow the basic guidelines on when determining if the dough is ready to bake. So here I have two shapes to show you. They're the most common shapes we're making in all of these classes. And I'm going to show you what to look for after the final proofing to see if your bread is ready to go in the oven or not. So if we're doing a baguette, we can check the same way we check for the bulk fermentation. So we're just going to put our finger and press gently. You'll see that we have a slight indentation, but then bounces back a little bit. Same as our bulk fermentation, if it feels like it bounces back very fast or the dough is quite heavy, or it doesn't leave that slight indentation after you're pressing, then you're going to want to proof your bread a little bit longer. If you press the dough and it completely almost collapses and your finger has no resistance pressing against it, then you overproofed your bread. If the bread is underproof, we can proof a little bit longer. At this stage, if your bread is overproofed, there's not really much that we can do to fix it. Your scoring may not open up nicely, or you may find that you have a bit of a more spongy texture inside the dough. Now, the same thing will be if we do a batard as well. So we just press the side of the batard, and you can see when we press, we have a slight indentation, but that springs back slowly. This will be the same basic principle for all breads that we make. So any type of bread that you're looking for, if you're not sure the stage, if it's done proofing for the bulk or the final, we'll check it just by touching. This is something that you're going to have to develop by doing more yourself. Even if you read as many books or watch as many videos as you do, you're going to have to make more bread and get that feeling for yourself. But if you look and you know what to look for now, you'll be able to develop this feeling very quickly. So now I'll show you the basic of scoring our bread. In a lot of our videos, we score the bread and we need to load directly inside the oven. So here I'm going to show you in a slower version explaining the angle of the blade and exactly how we go about scoring the bread to get a desired look. So for these, first I'll just dust a little bit of flour, but if you want that kind of look from the flour, we dust a very thin layer. Now first we'll talk about baguette. So when scoring a baguette, we have a few options. We can score one scoring, we can do 3, 5, or 7. Generally, we like to score an odd number on the baguette because it's going to play a look, make your baguette look a little bit longer and more appealing to the eye. Now, when we have our scoring blade, the first thing for all the breads we're proofing and scoring, we want to score at a 40-degree angle. So if you don't know 40 degrees, hold your blade straight and then turn it about halfway and then a little bit more. You could fit maybe about a quarter or a thick piece of shilling underneath. Next, for a baguette, we'll hold the tip and then we're going to score. If I'm going to score multiple scoring, I want to make sure that I overlap them properly. So here I'm going to score 1, then we're going to overlap the dough about a third, score another, and then finally for this baguette, a third scoring. All of our scoring should remain on top of the baguette. They shouldn't be so biased that they're coming all the way to the sides. So we have just a slight bias. We're not scoring straight down. We're not scoring like this. The scoring down the baguette is at about this angle. So we just hold. We're gonna hold the blade at a 40-degree angle with the back slightly raised so it doesn't tug on the dough. We're gonna cut with just the edge, about 1/4 of an inch deep. So we're gonna cut it just about 1/4 of an inch deep. You see I'm cutting in at an angle like this. If I cut straight down, my baguette will open wide like this. If I'm cutting it at an angle, creating this sort of lip, my baguette is gonna open with more of an ear. Now, if I wanted to do one straight scoring, I just do that from end to end. But here we're gonna do a few multiple scorings. So now I'm gonna overlap this cut by about 1/3 and then score the next one. And then again for the final cut. For a baguette with multiple cuts, we wanna make sure that all the cuts are the same length so they open evenly, and then also that we're slightly overlapping. If I didn't overlap here, let's say this cut came to here and the next one starts at the very end. You're gonna find the baguette will open thicker here. Here where there's no cut is gonna stay more tighter, and then open again where you cut again. So if you wanna have a nice straight baguette, all the cuts need to overlap slightly. Now for scoring something like a batard, we can score either straight down or also we can score at an angle. So one will be from end to end at a 40-degree angle, just like our baguette, straight here. The other will be in a crescent shape. So I show you how to do the crescent shape. We're gonna hold here. We'll hold the batard at one end and hold the blade at a 40-degree angle. Next, just where the bread begins to curve over. If we cut too low, there'll be too much dough over here. It won't be able to power enough to cut it, to open it up all the way. If we cut too high, also the scoring will come this way and we won't have the nice look as well. So if this is the middle, just where the bread starts to curve over, we're gonna cut there. So we'll come and then cut. One thing about your scoring is when you score, the bread shouldn't start opening up right away. We wanna keep a little bit of the strength, so we score it, load it directly in the oven, so all the strength will come in the oven spring and we get a nice ear to open. So one final thing that we need to consider when we're baking in different environments or we're baking at home is the oven that we're using. Now there's lots of types of ovens out there with different functions and using different brands. So one thing is you're gonna have to find the appropriate temperature for baking in your oven always. But I will show you a few different types of ovens that we have and show you some things that you may be able to do to get this type of oven to get the best result. So one type of oven we have will be your standard home oven. So here we have a standard type of home oven with an opening door with a small fan inside. But also we have many different functions here where we can have broil, roasting, and baking settings. So when you're baking with this type of oven, you'll follow the same type of procedure that we do in all of our lessons. However, one thing that you may find is you cannot get steam inside this oven. So there's a few ways to get steam, but one of the most common ways is we'll take a pot with some boiling water inside. Our oven will be preheated to our baking temperature, and then we'll put the pot of water inside the oven. Then we'll load our bread. When we put the bread inside, the pot of water will create some steam inside the oven, which will help you get more of a nice volume on your bread. When it comes to the part of the baking where you want to release the steam to dry out the bread, we'll put on an oven glove. Be careful because you don't want to forget and grab the pot with your hand. You'll put on a glove, you'll just remove the pot and allow the bread to continue baking the rest of the way to dry out and form a nice crust. So here we have another type of commercial oven we call a convection oven and also a combination ovens. So this oven we have here is fan forced. So one thing about using this type of oven is when you have the fan, it tends to dry out the bread very easy. Now this oven in particular, we can set the heat, we can also adjust the fan speed, but most importantly is we have a function which we can put steam inside this oven. This is the oven that we're baking most of our breads inside. So here, very simply, I have a function. When I put the bread inside, I can create steam inside the oven automatically, and then I can bake like I normally would. So now here we have a commercial deck oven. Now this is the best oven that we can use for making the bread, aside from even a wood fire oven. So when we bake bread in here, what's gonna set this apart from our other types of ovens is that on the bottom inside the oven, we have a stone. This stone will hold the heat very well, and it's going to transfer the heat directly to the bread, so we'll get a much better oven spring using this oven than if we're using a fan-forced oven or a home oven. The other thing about this oven is the steam function is extremely strong. So when we load our bread into the deck oven, we have the heat directly coming from the stone directly into the bread, and also we can press the steam, and we'll get a lot of steam coming out of this oven. So what it'll do is it'll fill the whole chamber with steam, so we have plenty of moisture during the initial phases of baking, so we can get a nice rise and a nice crust. So no matter what type of oven you're using, we have 3 different types. As long as we can get some steam and a good heat inside the oven, we'll be able to make nice bread. So I hope you enjoy this theory lesson, and happy baking.